you know. There's a very specific kind of vulnerability you feel when you finally move out of your parents' place for the first time. It's this intoxicating mix of total independence and a quiet, underlying anxiety. You are officially on your own. There is no safety net, no one to double-check the deadbolts for you before bed. If you hear a bump in the night, it's on you to figure out what it is, just you. About 2 years ago, my buddy Marcus and I decided it was time to bite the bullet. We were both 22, working entry-level tech jobs and completely burned out by the suffocating rent and the constant noise of living in downtown Seattle. We wanted some space. We wanted to see trees instead of concrete, so we started looking on the deep outskirts of the city, near the heavy, dense tree lines where the rent gets surprisingly affordable. And we found this place. It was a mid-century single-story ranch house sitting all by itself at the dead end of a long, unlit dirt road. It wasn't exactly a luxury home. The siding was faded. The floorboards had this deep, echoing groan whenever you shifted your weight, and the kitchen appliances looked like they belonged in a museum. But to us, it was absolute paradise. It was cheap, it was dead quiet, and the backyard was massive, backing right up against a wall of dense pine trees. We signed the lease after a 15-minute walkthrough. Honestly, we were just desperate to move in and start our new lives. But there was one detail we completely brushed over during that initial tour. Way in the back corner of the yard, half swallowed by overgrown blackberry bushes in shadow, was an old heavy-duty metal shed. It didn't look like a standard suburban garden shed. It looked industrial. The metal was thick and rusted at the edges, and slapped right across the latch of the double doors was this massive heavy iron padlock, the thick, weather-beaten kind. When we asked the landlord about it, he didn't even look twice. He just sighed and said, "Oh, that. It's just full of busted landscaping equipment from the guy who owned the property before me. The key's been missing for years. Just leave it be." And so we did. We had no reason to care about a rusty shed. The first few weeks were incredible. We bought a cheap grill, spent our evenings hanging out on the back porch, having a few beers, and just soaking in the absolute silence of the woods. It was the exact escape we had been looking for. But then, the reality of living in total isolation started to creep in, and things began to feel a little off. It started subtly. I'd be in the kitchen making coffee early in the morning, and I'd look out the window towards the backyard, and I swear, the tall grass leading from the tree line up to that rusted metal shed, it looked trampled, like a faint, muddy pathway had been walked back and forth. I tried to tell myself it was just stray dogs, or maybe raccoons scavenging in the night, rationalizing it, because the alternative was too unsettling to think about. But rationalizations only work until you can't ignore the facts anymore. It was a late Tuesday night. The weather was calm. Not a drop of rain, no wind, just that heavy, suffocating silence you only get in the woods. Marcus had already gone to bed. I was out in the living room, sitting in the dark, scrolling through my phone. The house was dead quiet. Then, I heard it. It was a heavy, dull clang. My blood instantly turned to ice. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the house settling. It sounded exactly like a thick metal door being pulled shut, and it came directly from the deep end of the backyard. I froze. My heart started hammering against my ribs. I slowly got up off the couch, keeping my footsteps as light as humanly possible, and crept over to the back window. I grabbed the heavy tactical flashlight I kept on the windowsill and clicked it on, sending a blinding beam of white light cutting through the darkness of the yard. I swept the beam across the grass, over the bushes, and finally, onto the shed, the heavy iron padlock. It wasn't locked. It was dangling entirely open, swinging just slightly, like it had just been touched. I immediately woke Marcus up. I didn't care that he had work in the morning. We both grabbed whatever we could use as a weapon, a baseball bat and a heavy wrench, and stepped out onto the back porch. The air was freezing. We shined the light at the shed for a solid 5 minutes, waiting for any movement, any sound, nothing. Neither of us had the guts to actually walk all the way out there and open those doors. We were terrified of what or who might be backed into a corner inside. So we retreated into the house, locked every single door, and stayed awake in the living room until the sun came up. The next morning, in the safety of daylight, we convinced ourselves it was a fluke. Maybe the lock was never fully clicked shut. Maybe the metal contracted in the cold, and it just popped open. It was a stupid excuse, but we needed to believe it to stay sane. But 3 nights later, the final shred of denial was violently ripped away. We were in the living room, the TV volume down low. I happened to glance up at the window. The porch light was on, casting a dim yellow glow over the first few feet of the lawn. And there, standing exactly at the edge where the light met the pitch-black darkness of the trees, was a figure. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was a man. He wasn't doing anything crazy. He wasn't pressing his face against the glass like a movie monster. He was just standing perfectly still. His hands were shoved deep into the pockets of a dark, filthy jacket, and his head was tilted slightly up, staring directly at our living room window, just watching us. My breath hitched in my throat. I tapped Marcus on the shoulder and pointed. The second Marcus saw him, he let out a sharp gasp. We didn't yell. We were too paralyzed by fear. The man didn't run. When he realized we were looking right back at him, he simply took a slow step backward, melting seamlessly into the impenetrable darkness of the tree line, moving in the exact direction of the shed. We called the police immediately. 2 officers showed up, took our statements, and walked out to the shed with their heavy-duty flashlights. They came back 10 minutes later, looking entirely unbothered. They said the padlock was closed, the area was clear, and it was probably just a homeless guy cutting through the property. They told us to keep our doors locked and drove away. They didn't take us seriously. We spent the next week living in a state of absolute, paranoid terror. We barely slept. Every creak of the house made us jump. And then the situation finally boiled over. It was around 3 a.m. on a Sunday. I woke up coughing violently. The air in my bedroom was thick and stifling. My eyes watered as I realized what I was smelling. It wasn't just wood smoke, it was gasoline. I threw off my covers, rushed to the window, and yanked the blinds up. The backyard was bathed in an aggressive, flickering orange light. The metal shed was engulfed in a massive inferno. Flames were roaring, shooting up into the night sky, twisting and devouring the structure. The heat was so intense I could feel it through the double-pane glass. Black, toxic smoke billowed into the air. I screamed for Marcus, and we bolted out the front door, terrified the fire would catch the dry grass and spread to the house. We called 911, standing shivering in our driveway until the fire trucks arrived. They doused the flames for nearly 45 minutes, until nothing was left but a smoking, blackened carcass of warped metal. Once the scene was secured, a fire investigator started sifting through the smoldering remains. We stood behind the yellow caution tape, waiting. When the investigator finally walked over to us, his expression was grim. Very grim. He confirmed it was arson. Someone had poured an accelerant all over the inside and tossed a match. But then, he told us what they found inside the ashes. There was no old landscaping equipment, no lawnmowers or shovels. Underneath the charred debris, they found the scorched metal springs of a twin-sized mattress. They found a plastic bucket used as a makeshift toilet. They found dozens of empty canned food tins. And worst of all, they found things that belonged to us. The investigator held up an evidence bag containing a half-melted spare house key that we thought we had lost weeks ago. Another bag held the charred remnants of Marcus's missing gray hoodie. And scattered throughout the ashes were crumpled grocery receipts from our own kitchen trash can. Someone hadn't just been cutting through our yard. A man had been living inside that shed for months, watching us, waiting until we left for work, and then casually walking into our home using our own spare key to take what he needed. I looked at the investigator, my stomach churning with nausea, and asked the one question that didn't make sense. But the padlock, it was locked from the outside. The cops checked it themselves. How could he lock himself inside? The investigator pulled something heavy out of his jacket pocket. It was the rusted iron padlock. He held it up to the harsh glare of the fire truck's floodlights and showed us the heavy metal shackle. It had been completely sawed through. The cut was perfectly clean, hidden beneath the thick metal casing. The lock was never actually securing the doors. The squatter had cut it months ago and simply hooked it back onto the latch so that from a distance it looked perfectly untouched. He was living right under our noses, and when he realized we had finally spotted him standing in the yard that night, he knew his time was up. So he poured gasoline over his makeshift life, burned all the evidence of his existence to the ground, and vanished into the woods forever. We didn't even sleep there that night. We packed our cars at dawn, broke our lease without a second thought, and never went back. To this day, I check every window. I check every lock, because now I know, just because something looks secure from the outside, doesn't mean you're safe. There is a false sense of security that comes with living in a large apartment complex. You convince yourself that because there are hundreds of people living around you, because you can hear your upstairs neighbor walking around and smell the dinner being cooked down the hall, that you are inherently safe. You think that if anything bad were to happen, someone would hear, someone would intervene. But the terrifying reality is, walls only block the view. They don't block the danger. A few years ago, I was living in a pretty decent mid-rise apartment building. It was a secure building. You needed a fob to get into the lobby, a fob to use the elevator, and a physical key for your actual unit. I lived on the 3rd floor with my roommate Sarah. We felt totally safe there. It was the week of Thanksgiving. Sarah had taken an early flight back to the East Coast to be with her family, leaving me alone in the apartment for 5 days. I was actually looking forward to it. Just a quiet, lazy week with no responsibilities. It was Wednesday evening around 7 p.m. The sun had already set and the apartment was dimly lit. I had just gotten out of the shower and was standing in the bathroom, drying my hair with a towel. I had my phone resting on the sink, playing a podcast on low volume. The bathroom door was open, leading out into the short hallway that connected to the main living area. As I was rubbing the towel through my hair, I felt it. A physical change in the atmosphere. A sharp, distinct drop in temperature. It was a cold draft of air that swept across my bare ankles. My heater was on. The windows were locked shut. There was absolutely no reason for a draft like that unless the front door had just been opened to the unheated hallway. I stopped drying my hair. I turned the podcast off. The apartment plunged into absolute dead silence. I stepped slowly out of the bathroom and peered down the hallway toward the living room. The front door was completely wide open, and stepping into my apartment was a man. He wasn't a shadowy monster. He didn't have a weapon drawn. He was just an ordinary-looking guy in his mid-30s, wearing a damp wool coat. I was completely paralyzed. My brain simply couldn't process the geometry of the situation. I had locked the deadbolt when I came home from work. I always do. But he hadn't broken the door down. He had simply unlocked it. Before I could even force a sound out of my throat, the man reached back, pushed the heavy front door shut, and reached for the lock. Click, he threw the deadbolt, locking himself inside my apartment. With me, the sound of that metallic click echoed in my ears like a gunshot. My survival instinct finally kicked in. I didn't run, I didn't scream. I just instinctively took a sharp step backward, my foot scraping loudly against the bathroom tile. The man's head snapped toward the hallway. We locked eyes. I will never forget the look on his face. It wasn't predatory. It wasn't maniacal. It was genuine surprise. He looked like a deer caught in the headlights. He stared at me for 3 agonizingly long seconds. "Oh," he stammered, raising his hand slightly, taking a quick step backward. "Oh shit, my bad. I thought this was Unit 3B. He didn't wait for my response. He frantically reached behind his back, unlocked the deadbolt, pulled the door open, and practically sprinted down the hallway. I heard his heavy footsteps echoing down the corridor until they faded away entirely. My knees buckled. I slumped against the wall, hyperventilating. It took me a full minute to gather the courage to walk over to the door. I slammed it shut. I threw the deadbolt. I hooked the metal security chain across the frame, and I wedged a heavy dining chair under the doorknob. Then I called the police. 2 officers arrived about 20 minutes later. I unhooked the chain to let them in, my hands shaking so badly I could barely manage the lock. I explained everything to them. I told them what he looked like, what he said. One of the officers wrote it down, but his expression was completely dismissive. He gave me that condescending, reassuring smile. "Miss, it happens all the time," the officer said. "People get off on the wrong floor. Their brains go on autopilot. and they just walk into the wrong apartment. But his key worked, I argued, my voice cracking. How did his key open my locked door? The officer shrugged. Sometimes these cheap apartment locks get worn out, or the key cuts are similar enough to trigger the pins. Or maybe you just forgot to lock it. We'll do a sweep of the building, but honestly, it was probably just an honest mistake. They left. I was completely alone again. The logical part of my brain desperately wanted to believe the cops. An honest mistake, just a worn-out lock. But my gut, that primal, deeply ingrained human instinct, it was screaming at me. Unit 3B was on the complete opposite end of the building, and you don't step into an apartment that isn't yours. Close the door behind you and lock the deadbolt. That night, I didn't sleep. I dragged a heavy dresser across the room and pushed it against the front door. I kept the bathroom light on. I lay in my bed fully dressed, clutching my cell phone to my chest, staring at the ceiling in the pitch black. Hours ticked by. Midnight a.m. 2 a.m. The apartment building was dead quiet. The only sound was the distant, low hum of the refrigerator. And then, at 2:45 a.m., the hum was broken by something else. It was incredibly faint at first, coming from the living room. Shh, shh. It was the distinct, unmistakable sound of a metal key sliding slowly into the front door lock. My blood turned to ice water. My chest tightened so violently couldn't draw a breath. I lay completely frozen in my bed, straining my ears in the darkness. Click, the deadbolt disengaged. Then the doorknob turned, the heavy door pushed open, but it only opened an inch before it slammed hard against the metal security chain I had hooked across the frame. And then it bumped against the dresser I had pushed in front of it. The man was back. I didn't make a sound. I slipped off the bed, crawled silently across the carpet, and slid into my bedroom closet. I pulled the closet door shut, buried myself behind a row of winter coats, and dialed 911. My fingers were trembling so aggressively I dropped my phone the first time. When the dispatcher answered, I didn't speak. I put the phone right against my mouth and whispered, barely making a sound. Someone is trying to get into my apartment. He has a key. While the dispatcher was silently dispatching units, the noises from the living room escalated. He wasn't pretending to be at the wrong apartment anymore. He knew the chain was engaged. I heard a harsh, metallic scraping sound. He was slipping something through the narrow gap in the door, maybe a coat hanger or a piece of wire, trying to knock the metal chain off its track. The scraping went on for agonizing minutes. Clatter. Scratch. Every single metallic noise sent a jolt of pure electricity through my nervous system. I sat in the pitch-black closet, clamping my hand over my mouth to muffle the sound of my own hyperventilation. When the wire didn't work, his frustration boiled over. The doorknob began to shake violently. He started throwing his weight against the door. Thud, thud, the heavy wood rattled in its frame. The dresser I had pushed against it was screeching slowly across the hardwood floor with every impact. He was going to get in. It was only a matter of seconds. But then, the distant wail of police sirens pierced the night air. The thudding against the door instantly stopped. There was a fraction of a second of absolute silence. And then, I heard the rapid, heavy thumping of boots sprinting down the hallway, rushing toward the emergency stairwell. By the time the police burst into the building with their guns drawn, the hallway was completely empty. They searched the stairwells, the roof, the basement. They found nothing. Whoever he was, he had vanished into the city. The police inspected my door. The metal lock casing was scratched to hell. The frame was slightly splintered from where he was throwing his shoulder against it. But the scariest part was what the building manager confirmed the next morning. The lock wasn't broken. The key cuts weren't a coincidence. Someone had used a master key, a key that had full access to every single unit in the building. They never found out who it was. The building manager claimed no master keys were missing. Was it a previous maintenance worker who made a copy? A former tenant? Someone who worked in the leasing office? I didn't stick around to find out. I packed 2 suitcases, broke my lease that very morning, and stayed in a hotel until Sarah came back to help me move my furniture out. To this day, I have never felt safe in an apartment building again. Because the scariest monsters aren't the ones that break your windows in the middle of the night. The scariest ones are the ones who already have the key to your front door. There is a very specific kind of silence that exists in a house when you live completely alone. It's heavy. It settles into the corners of the rooms. When you first buy a home, you spend the first few months just learning its language. You learn which floorboards creak when the temperature drops. You learn the low, rattling hum of the refrigerator. You learn the hollow thud the pipes make when the water shuts off. You categorize all these noises in your brain as safe. But when you hear a noise that isn't on that list, your body reacts before your conscious mind even realizes why. Your stomach drops, your breathing stops, because deep down you know, houses don't just make new sounds for no reason. A few years ago, I finally saved up enough to buy my first house. I was 28, ready to settle down, and looking for something with a little more space. I searched for months, and eventually found this beautiful, 2-story colonial. It was 20 minutes outside of town, surrounded by dense old-growth trees. It was a little more isolated than I originally wanted, but the price had been slashed tremendously. Putting it right in the middle of my budget, I bought it. It felt like a massive step forward in my life. Worked from home as a data analyst, so I set up my office right in the main living room, enjoying the massive windows that looked out into the quiet woods. The house had a full, unfinished basement. It was essentially just a massive empty cavern of poured concrete. Aside from the water heater and the HVAC unit in the far corner, it was completely bare. I didn't even have enough boxes to put down there. The only natural light came from a few small, rectangular egress windows near the ceiling, which looked out into these deep, corrugated metal window wells on the outside of the house. The first few days were peaceful, but by the middle of the first week, things took a turn. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting at my desk, typing up a report, wearing noise-canceling headphones with no music playing, just using them to block out distractions. The house was dead quiet. Then I felt a vibration through the floorboards. I took off my headphones. I listened intently. Coming from the basement directly beneath my feet was a heavy, dragging sound. Scrap! It sounded like a heavy wooden crate being pulled across the raw concrete floor. I froze. I slowly got out of my chair, walked over to the basement door and opened it. I flicked on the stairwell light and listened. The sound instantly stopped. It was completely silent. I walked a few steps down, peering over the wooden railing. The basement was exactly as I had left it, empty, dust motes dancing in the harsh yellow light. Nothing had moved, nothing was there. I let out a nervous breath, chalking it up to my imagination, or the HVAC unit kicking on in a weird way. I went back upstairs, closed the door, and got back to work. But the next day it happened again. This time it wasn't a drag, it was a distinct, solid thud, like a piece of lumber being dropped onto the floor. Again, I opened the door. Again, absolute silence. The basement was empty. By the fourth time it happened, I actually stopped checking. I convinced myself that it was just the acoustic properties of an empty house echoing sounds from outside, or maybe the plumbing acting up. I forced myself to ignore it, because acknowledging that it might be something else was too terrifying. That false sense of security shattered on a Saturday afternoon. I was outside, doing some basic yard work, raking dead leaves away from the foundation of the house. As I walked around to the blind side of the house, the side facing the thickest part of the woods, I noticed something entirely out of place. The heavy plastic cover that sat over one of the deep basement window wells was completely gone. It hadn't blown away. There hadn't been any heavy wind. It had been physically unlatched, lifted off, and discarded into the tree line about 20 feet away. My stomach tied itself into a tight knot. I walked over to the well and looked down. The small glass window at the bottom was shut, but the locking latch looked bent, scraped. I immediately drove to the local hardware store, bought a brand new, heavy-duty cover, and installed it that same afternoon, making sure it was tightly secured. I tried to tell myself it was teenagers messing around or maybe an animal, but my anxiety was skyrocketing. That night I went to bed early. I locked every door, double-checked every window, and lay in the dark staring at the ceiling. At 11 p.m. I woke up with a violent jolt. The house was completely silent, but my heart was racing. And then I heard the sound that still gives me nightmares to this day, coming from the basement, directly beneath my bedroom floor. Footsteps. Not the skittering of a raccoon, not the creak of settling wood, These were heavy, deliberate two-legged footsteps pacing across the concrete. Step, 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 someone was down there, pacing back and forth. I didn't play the hero. I didn't grab a baseball bat and slowly walk down into the pitch-black basement like some idiot in a movie. I value my life way too much for that. I silently slipped out of bed, grabbed the heavy wooden chair from my vanity, and completely silently slid it under the doorknob of my bedroom door. I grabbed my phone, crawled into the corner of my room furthest from the door, and dialed 911. My hands were shaking so violently I almost dropped the phone. I whispered my address to the dispatcher, begging them to hurry. The entire time I was listening to the footsteps downstairs. They weren't rummaging. They weren't looking for things to steal. They were just pacing in the center of the room, just existing in my space. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. There was a long, agonizing pause, and then I heard a massive echoing bang from outside the house. It sounded like thick plastic hitting the siding, then silence. 10 minutes later, flashing red and blue lights illuminated my bedroom walls. I stayed barricaded in my room until I heard the officers announce themselves in the hallway. I unlocked the door, practically in tears, and pointed toward the basement. The officers drew their weapons, flicked the stairwell light on, and went down. I stayed at the top of the stairs, gripping the railing, completely unable to breathe. 5 minutes later, an officer walked up the stairs. His expression was serious. "The basement is clear," he said. "Nobody is down there right now." I let out a sob, leaning against the wall. But I heard them. I swear to God, there were footsteps. "I believe you," the officer said quietly. He motioned for me to follow him. "Come look at this." I walked down the stairs, my legs shaking. The officer pointed his high-powered flashlight at the raw concrete floor. It was covered in a thin, even layer of dust, since I had never used the space. But right in the center of the room, directly underneath where my bed was upstairs, the dust was heavily disturbed. There was a clear, undeniable set of muddy boot prints. They came from the far corner window, paced back and forth in a tight circle in the center of the room, and then led right back to the window. We walked outside to the side of the house. The brand new, heavy-duty window well cover I had installed that afternoon, it had been violently ripped off its hinges and thrown against the side of the house. That was the loud bang I had heard before the police arrived. The intruder hadn't come to steal my TV. They hadn't come for my laptop. They had specifically broken into my basement, stood in the pitch black directly beneath my bedroom, and just listened to me sleep. The police searched the woods, but they found nothing. The boot prints disappeared into the heavy brush. We never found out who it was. A drifter? A stalker? The previous owner? The very next morning, I hired a contractor to weld thick iron bars over every single basement window. I installed a blaring security system and motion sensor lights on every corner of the property. I still live in the house. I refuse to be driven out, but the basement remains completely empty. And sometimes, when the winter winds rattle the windows and the house gets too quiet, I find myself staring at the floorboards, holding my breath, waiting to hear a footstep answer back.